can, the only one who does, and the only one who will. Amen.
Thank you. I remembered the stand, but not the microphone, so that helps, thanks. My name's Miriam, I'm the young adults pastor here, if I haven't had the chance to meet you. I wanted to talk to you today about generosity and about debt. But first of all, we're going to do things a little differently today. Firstly, I'm going to we're all going to hear from our Bible readings coming from people who've done the Bible storytelling workshop this weekend. So you'll get a little taster of what we've been learning, and you'll get to see what we've been practicing all through this weekend. And then after that, I'm going to give you the point of the sermon before we start. So if you need something to write down, that's the one thing you can write down. I'll give it to you as a freebie before we get cracking. But we'll start by hearing 3 stories from 3 of us. I'll be sharing the first one, and then Deirdre will come, and then Lauren, my dad, not Lauren up here, will come and share the third one. So first of all, I'd like to tell you a story from Genesis. See, a really long time ago, there was a man named Abram. Now, Abram was an old man, and he was a servant of the living God. And one day, God said to Abram, I will be your great shield and protector, and I will give you great blessings. And Abram said, God, thank you, that's amazing. You've given me so much, everything I could ever want in my life. But the one thing you haven't given me is a son, and so I have no one to inherit all the blessings you've given me, no one to pass it down to. So what's the point? And God said, actually, Abram, you will have a son, even as an old man. And then God took Abram outside and said, look up at the stars. Can you count them? Have a crack, see what happens. That is how many descendants you will have. And Abram believed God, and God was really pleased with him and accepted him. And then God continued, Abram, I'm also going to give you and your descendants a land that will belong to them, a place to inherit. And Abram said, God, he questioned what God said and said, how do I know that this will happen? And so God said to Abram, go and get me a cow, a sheep, and a goat, and a couple of birds as well. So Abram went out and got these animals, and he brought them back, and then he butchered them, and then he cut each animal in half, and he laid the halves with the opposite halves facing each other to make a track on the ground between each half. And he spent the day chasing away the birds of prey that came down on the carcasses. And then sunset, and Abram fell into a deep sleep, probably exhausted from all that butchering. And a great darkness fell over Abram. And God said to him, Abram, I promise you, you will live a long life, and you will die at peace, an old man. But I have other promises for your descendants. I promise that they will be taken captive and enslaved by a nation not their own for 400 years. But at the end of that time, when the time is right, I will free them from that land, I will deliver justice, and I will bring them to the land that they will inherit. And at that moment, while Abram slept, a cooking pot smoking and a torch on fire moved between the carcasses of the animals down the track made between them. And in that way, God made this covenant, this oath between kings with Abram. So let's take a moment to think just quietly, reflect to ourselves, what surprised you in that story? Well, now hear our second story from Deirdre.
Well, one day, a religious leader named Simon invited Jesus to come to dinner with him. So Jesus found the house and went in and reclined on next to the low dining table. Now, there happened to be in that same city a woman known to have bad and immoral deeds, and she was desperate to see Jesus. And she heard where Jesus was going to dine, so she came along, and she brought with her a beautiful jar filled with very expensive perfume. She was very overcome with emotion. She stood behind Jesus and she was sobbing uncontrollably. And her tears fell and wet Jesus' feet. She bent down and wiped them with her long hair and started kissing his feet lovingly. And she poured out all of this perfume over his feet. And the beautiful aroma arose in that room. Now, Simon, the host, see what was going on, and he was thinking to himself, look, if this man is truly a man of God, surely he knows what kind of woman is touching him, a woman of bad and immoral deeds. Now, Jesus knew what Simon was thinking. He said, Simon, I've got something to tell you. Simon said, yes, teacher, tell me. Jesus said, there were two men who owed money to a moneylender. One owed 500 silver coins and the other owed 50. When it came time to pay back this loan, neither of them could pay. They were unable, they didn't have the money. And fortunately, the moneylender forgave both their debts. Who do you think would love him more after that? Simon said, well, pretty clear, it'll be the one who was forgiven the larger amount of money. Quite correct, said Jesus. Pointing to the woman and speaking to Simon, he said, now, Simon, when I came to your house today, you did not give me any water to wash my dusty feet. But she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss as a greeting, but she hasn't stopped kissing my feet. You did not pay me the courtesy of oil for my head, but she has poured out all this beautiful perfume on my feet. I tell you, although her bad deeds are many, she is forgiven, shown by her great love. The person who is forgiven little loves little. And he turned to the woman and said, your bad deeds are forgiven. People around, of course, well, who's this man going around forgiving bad and immoral deeds? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace.
So what surprised you about that story? Take a moment.
So one day, a young man came to Jesus and said, what do I need to get life that goes on forever? What good deed do I need to do? Good teacher. Jesus said, interesting that you call me good. Only God is good. But to answer your question, obey what God has commanded. What commandments should I obey? Honour your parents. Honour your wife. Don't play around. Don't kill. Don't steal. Don't slander your neighbour falsely. Love your neighbour as yourself. Oh, good, says the young man. I've done all those things. What else do I need to do? You want 10 out of 10? Go and sell everything you've got, and the money you get, give it to the poor. And then follow me, and you'll have treasure in heaven. And the young man went away sad, because he had lots of money and lots of possessions and lots of farms. Jesus said, it's so difficult for the rich to enter heaven. It's going to be harder than a camel to get its two humps in itself through the eye of a needle. Jesus' followers were surprised. What do you mean? How's anyone from here going to get to heaven? Jesus said, what's impossible for humans is possible for God. Oh, what about us? His followers said. We've given up homes and brothers and sisters and parents to follow you. And Jesus said, in the kingdom that is to come, all those who've given up brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and homes to follow me will receive 100 times and more so. But those who are great in this world will become little, and those who are little in this world will become great.
Take a moment. What surprised you about that story? Let's also take a moment to thank those Bible storytellers, because I think they did an amazing job. And that was just one day of learning. So I told you that I would give you the cheat sheet for the sermon. So here it is. We are in debt to God, and there's no way we can pay it back. And that's a really, really good place to be. We begin with Genesis 15, the story of Abraham. We're going to pop back in the slides to the Genesis 15 slide. And we begin with Abram, who's this old man, and he accepts God's promise of descendants and people, and he knows that that's coming. But he has a hard time accepting the promise of a nation. He's just one man. And so God says, I'll make a covenant with you. But he doesn't just make any agreement, any oath, any vow between two people. He asks Abram to go get these animals. And Abram knows what's happening. He obviously recognizes what he's been asked to do, because God doesn't tell him butcher them and separate them. But Abram has learned this somewhere along the line. It's not a natural reflex when we have animals to cut them in half and spread them around. I hope not. So he knows that something particular is going on. And what he's recognizing is that this is a covenant between two nations. God is offering him a promise that is made between kings. So even before Abraham has a nation, even before he has a child or his wife is pregnant, God says, you want to know if you'll have a nation? Here, make a nation covenant with me. Go get the animals. And so Abraham spreads the animals and waits for God to appear to walk between. And he waits all day, and the birds are circling around, and God has yet to appear. And finally at sunset, he falls into this deep sleep. And it is that time that something happens. It is that time that God appears. Because instead of permitting Abram to take one of the halves of the covenant, he fulfills both parts himself. Knowing that Abram could never pay him back, he takes on both parts, the part of both kings. Now, what would happen in this covenant is you've got the bloodied corpses lying on the ground of the animals, the carcasses, and you walk this bloody path, the two kings. And as you make this vow together, you're also invoking a curse on yourselves if one of you breaks it. You're saying, may it happen to me if I break this curse, what has happened to these animals? So it's a really serious promise. And there's no way that Abram can uphold his side of that bargain. There's no way that his descendants can do it. And God knows this. And when Abram's descendants fail in their part of the covenant, as God knows that they will, punishment for a broken covenant falls on Jesus. God not only forgives the debt of his people, he pays what we owe in full. A debt that is forgiven without any payment taking place was never a debt to begin with. And so God makes a two-sided covenant and upholds both sides so that Abraham and his descendants, physical and spiritual, can receive and be offered the gift of life, eventually revealed in Jesus. Let's look now at Luke 7. Jesus has been invited to the house of Simon the Pharisee, and he goes along, and Simon brings him in, but he doesn't wash his feet, doesn't offer him a kiss of greeting, doesn't offer him oil to anoint his head. And all of these things are ways to welcome an honored guest. Do you know what it would be like to walk barefoot in the streets with all the animals your whole life? That's a pretty smelly experience. And so when you come in and you're going to be seated at a low table and feet are kind of near the food, it's really valuable to wash your feet when you come in. And that is what would have happened in any hospitality situation. And yet Simon doesn't really bother with that. And nor does he kiss him on the cheek as a way of saying, I'm so glad you're here. And we know in Psalm 23 that God anoints the head of his beloved with oil, this way of caring for his children, of saying, I love you and you are precious to me. And Simon does none of these things. Now, we don't do any of those things today either. We don't wash our feet when we come into someone's house. We don't kiss each other on the cheek as greeting, unless maybe we're French or Middle Eastern. And we don't pour oil over each other's heads. That would probably be seen as an act of aggression rather than welcome if we did it today. So what's the equivalent for Australia in our current context? Well, I wonder if it's a bit like inviting someone over for dinner and then opening the door and be like, oh, okay, yeah, just go sit in the living room and I'll go sort the rest of the stuff out, and just hanging out in the rest of your house without them. Maybe preparing the food or hanging out with your friends. Or perhaps it's like opening the door and be like, oh, that's right, you. Yep, come in, have a seat, that's fine. Perhaps it's like getting, the plate that you had from breakfast and brushing off the toast crumbs and be like, here, you can put some food on that. You might be welcoming your guest in, but it's a pretty horrid way to do it, and you're not showing them in any way, shape or form that you're actually particularly interested in having them there. Simon had invited Jesus into his house, but he wasn't doing much with it. He was only offering him the bare minimum of hospitality. Behold, I stand at the door and knock, says Jesus. When we invite Jesus into our lives, do we offer him the bare minimum of hospitality? Yeah, you can come in. Maybe just stay off my browser history and out of maybe the bedroom and the kitchen, and just stay there and I'll come to you when I want to talk to you. And in direct opposition to that, we have a certain immoral woman. We're not told what makes her immoral, but that is how she's identified. And she hears that Jesus has come to this town, and she is so excited to see him, and she grabs a flask of perfume worth, it says, over a year's wages. So probably, let's say, 50 grand. I'd be terrified to even carry something worth 50 grand in my hand. And she grabs it and brings it to Simon's house. And she comes in and stands behind Jesus, weeping. I don't know if you've cried much recently, but what is being described here is not the delicate tear trickling down the cheek and the fluttering of the eyelashes and the quivering lip, and it's all very beautiful and poignant. This woman is sobbing at Jesus' feet. And her tears, and probably even some snot, are falling onto his feet. And seeing what's happening and probably embarrassed, she kneels down and she grabs what is nearby, her hair, and she starts to dry his feet with her hair. And she doesn't care that she's getting the dust and the dung of the street in her hair. She doesn't care as she begins to kiss his feet, that they're probably pretty gross. She just wants to make up for what she's done and tell him that she loves him. She continues to kiss his feet and pours this incredible, expensive perfume all over them. This is an embarrassing display of emotion. Imagine sitting down for dinner and someone comes in, weeping and wailing, sobbing over your feet and kissing them and pouring perfume on them. I cannot imagine that something like that could particularly be ignored. Can you imagine everyone sitting there? It's kind of awkward. This woman is wailing, somewhere between a hysterical child and a mother who's just discovered her child after they've been lost, and there's so much emotion and noise, and then there's perfume going on, and it's just, what is going on? And yet, she does not care that she is making people uncomfortable. She doesn't care that she's breaking cultural taboos in coming into Simon's house as an unclean woman. She doesn't care that she is touching someone of the opposite gender or that she is crying over his feet. She doesn't care that she is even as an unclean or immoral woman touching a holy man. In those days, if you wanted to be holy, you would have to go through a whole series of procedures of bathing and washing yourself to keep yourself clean and purified. And so if someone who is unholy, immoral, considered to have done the wrong thing, comes in and touches you, all of that is forfeit. And you have to go and do all of your cleansing again. And so it was not okay for an unclean, immoral person to touch a holy person. Can you imagine it? The smell of the perfume, the sound of the wailing, the awkward silences. As in so many other situations, Jesus challenges the social norms by, first of all, not recoiling. He doesn't run away. What are you doing? Get off my feet, woman. This is really uncomfortable. I'll come and talk to you later once you've calmed down. But actually, he knows that as the Holy Son of God, his goodness, his cleanness is so strong that the reverse happens. It cleans her. It makes her fresh and new. But he's not just paying attention to her. He turns to Simon, Simon who's thinking things but not saying them. And he says, Simon, can I tell you a story? And he tells the story of the moneylender and the two who owe him money. And he offers Simon this simple mathematical equation. And Simon has been studying since he was a child, and so he knows, the person who owes the most is the person who's most thankful. That's pretty obvious. And then Jesus takes a moment to confront Simon for his inhospitality and his arrogance. He has ignored the Holy Son of God in his house. And he challenges him and he shames him in that context. Jesus can only forgive Simon what Simon is willing to ask Jesus forgiveness for. So if Simon thinks he needs no forgiveness, he can receive nothing from Jesus. On the other end of the spectrum, this immoral woman, in her overwhelming emotion, acknowledges the significance of Jesus' presence, acknowledges her many sins and what it is that she offers him, and he offers her, and she weeps for her life and for her sin. She holds absolutely nothing back in her response to him. And neither does Jesus. He offers her life and freedom. We come at last to the story of Matthew 19. Now, earlier in this passage, we heard last week about Jesus' views on divorce and marriage. And then there's a little section which we're not covering in the sermon series that talks about when the children come to Jesus and they're initially ushered away or shooed away by his disciples. But Jesus says, no, they're welcome. And they come and he blesses them and he points to them as examples of what it means to come into the kingdom of God. You want to be part of the kingdom of God? Be like a child. And then the very next story, a young man comes to Jesus and says, "Good teacher, what good deed must I do to be saved?" What is the ultimate task that will get me into heaven? How much good is good enough? Now, Jesus, true to form, answers a question with a question. Why ask me about what is good? That is, why have you come to me? If you think I know more about being good than you, is that because you think I have some connection to the only one who is good? Perhaps he is challenging the young man to think about what he's looking for. But he also then goes on to actually answer the question. Rather disappointingly, however, would have been a frustrating interaction for that young man. Do all the things that you've already been told to do. Do the commandments that God has given you. And the young man keeps pushing. But which ones, please and thank you, can I have a list? This is not that complicated. I'm just asking you which task is going to get me into heaven. And so Jesus answers with specific commandments. And it's interesting which ones he chooses, because he lists the final five, or the five of the second half of the 10 Commandments. But he leaves out the first four, and he leaves out the very last one. And then he includes this summarizing commandment. So he lists, do not commit adultery, do not murder, do not steal, do not bear false witness. And then there's another one. What am I missing? Nope, I've lost it. Anyway, and love your neighbor as yourself. So he's giving him these 5 commandments. Now we're going to pause a little bit and just jump ahead to Matthew 22, where a few chapters later, Jesus is asked by an expert in religious law, which is the greatest commandment? And Jesus answers, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and a second is equally important. Love your neighbor as yourself. The entire law and all the demands of the prophets are based on these 2 commandments. So the 10 commandments are made up of laws that relate to how we interact with God and laws that tell us how we interact with other people. The first 4, how we interact with God, and the second 6, how we interact with people. And Jesus only lists off commandments from how we interact with people. But he misses one at the very end. He misses do not covet. And some commentators wonder if this is because, as a rich young man, Jesus knew this would be the one he most struggled with. Perhaps he was leaving that silence there for the young man to wonder about. But when Jesus lists all of those laws, he's including the implication that the young man must be doing the first 4. If we love God, then we can love people. But if we are not loving our neighbor well, then we are not truly loving God. This young man comes to Jesus confident that he is fulfilling the law. He is sure, as was common in Jewish society and religion at the time, that his money means that God is blessing him and is pleased with him. So he knows he's doing good. He's doing the good deeds that should be doing, and God's clearly happy. How often do we hear today that someone is a good person? We use it to build our identities around. I'm a good person. I haven't murdered anyone. That's a bad person. I know what a bad person is. It's a murderer, not me. Great. I've also, I'm kind to people. I don't yell at the waiters. I haven't cheated on my spouse. I don't hit my kids. I'm a good person. Why would I need to be forgiven? We use it to soothe our self-doubt. It's okay. I'm a good person. I didn't mean it. This young man was a good person. But the rich young man and the Pharisees have the same problem. They both want a list of good deeds, of laws, of exactly how much devotion they need to give to God. What percentage of their life do they owe to God? This young man doesn't want to be in debt to anyone, even God. And so he comes asking for the exact good person criteria. How often do we ask that of ourselves? How much is good enough? How many chapters should I be reading of my Bible in one go to make me a good Christian? How many minutes should I be spending in prayer? Is 5 enough, or is that not super holy? If I go to 30 minutes, does that make me better? Martin Luther used to pray for 3 hours and, he did some big stuff, but he was also kind of cantankerous the whole time. So I don't know if that's our winning equation. What about the more subtle standards that we equate to goodness? I eat healthy. I go to bed on time. I studied hard in school. I work hard. I have a good Protestant work ethic. I don't argue with my spouse in public. I don't get drunk. All of those are good things. Jesus is not saying that the commandments are not good things. In fact, they're amongst the most important laws that God has given us. But if we're trying to figure out what tasks we must do or not do, how much we have to give God in order to satisfy the requirements for salvation, then we've missed the point completely. Just so with the rich young man. He wants a roadmap of exactly what he must do and exactly how devoted he must be. And when he keeps pushing, Jesus answers his heart question. And I wonder if this is what his heart question sounded like. Can I keep something for myself? Just a little bit. Maybe some time, some possessions, some vices, some desires, some money, some control. What did Jesus answer? Nope. No. Jesus wants it all. It's all or nothing. He wants total relationship. He needs to be the total Lord of our lives. This young man has done all the good things, but he still feels like something is missing. And Jesus says, if you want to be the most good, you want to be perfect, all right. Give up all the things in your life that get in the way of you and God. Give up all your possessions. Sell it, get rid of it, give the money to the poor, and then come follow me. There are 2 steps required here: to give up, to let go, and then to follow. What do we need to let go of before we can follow? Or where are we hiding behind good deeds to avoid giving our all to God? But this sermon was meant to be about generosity, right? Are we getting off track, or do we feel like we're close? I have another story, but this one's from my own life. A few years ago, I was in Bible college and I was writing up an assignment. And I don't know if back in the day, some of you oldies might remember this. We had to submit paper assignments on actual paper, and we weren't allowed to email it in, and we had to put it through a slot in the door, and the graders would come and take the tub away and stamp that it had been received that day. And we had to use print cards that you had to pay for in cash, and then the librarian would put the credit on your card. It was a whole big process. So I was at the library at this Bible college, and I'm finishing off my assignment, and it was probably due at 5, and knowing me, it was probably 4:50, and I'm finishing off this assessment, and I'm getting it done. I'm like, great, it's finished, it's ready to go, I can print, and I have no money left on my print card. Okay, I'm kind of screwed. So I look around, and there's another student there in the library with me, a Sudanese man called Duku. So I go up to Duku and I say, hey, I'm sorry, mate, can I just borrow a couple of dollars to draw my print card? Just need to print off this assignment real quick. He says, yeah, that's fine. Here, and he gives me a $10 note. So I take the $10 and I rush down to the librarian, the front desk, and I said, can you put $2 on my print card and give me the change? And then I go upstairs, give the change back to Duku, and go to sit down at the computer and print off my assignment. And a few minutes later, Duku comes up to me, very graciously, says, I just want to let you know what happened here and what this means, what you've done. In his cultural context, in refusing to accept a full amount of generosity, in giving him the change back, I was A, reducing our friendship to a financial transaction, and B, insulting his generosity by refusing to accept it, by taking just the bare minimum. I was saying I didn't want to be in any relational debt to him at all, and that our friendship was just about the money. I was horrified, and I apologized, and I accepted the rest of the change back, the full generosity. And we went about our days. Now, this might seem really distant from the way that we relate here in Australia, but actually, that world that Jesus moved in had a lot more in common with those understandings of generosity, and we have something to learn from them. By seeking to pay back God's incredible generosity in Jesus with good deeds, we are firstly reducing our relationship with God to a transaction. Here's my good deeds to pay off my salvation. We're also implying that it's a transaction we can afford to make. And I hate to break it to you, we can't. It's just not a thing. It's not something we can do. He's the Lord of the universe, and we're really not. Not even the wealthiest donor in our church can buy an iota more of grace. And not even Mother Teresa could earn her way into heaven. So as the disciples say, well, who in the world can be saved then? If wealth can't do it and good deeds can't do it, what's the point? And Jesus replies, well, humanly speaking, yeah, it's impossible. But with God, everything is possible. By attempting to pay back or earn God's grace with a list of good deeds, we are saying that we don't want to be in relationship with him. I don't want to owe you anything, God. I'd like to pay off my debt. So how is debt a good thing? Just as a seesaw functions best in imbalance, so the uneven relationship we have with God is the only and best way to be in relationship with him. By accepting all of God's grace and therefore offering all of ourselves, we're admitting our deep need of him. Like Abraham, who knew that God was the only one who could carry both sides of that covenant. Like the woman who knew that she just needed to cry and let everything out and offer everything to Jesus in thanksgiving because she had nothing to offer him. Like the children who came to him to be blessed. Like so many have gone before and will come after us. To remain in debt to God is exactly where we should be, and it's the best place we could be. If we start to calculate how much is good enough, we twist our relationship with God into a spreadsheet of transactions, complex equations, particular laws to follow. It starts to sound a lot like the Pharisees. But as T.S. Eliot said, in a quote that is about to come up, 2 slides along, thank you, perfect. Following Jesus isn't meant to be complex. It's actually the simplest thing in the world. Costing not less than everything. So why then didn't Jesus tell the rich young man to give his money to Jesus' ministry or to the temple? Why did he say to give it to the poor? Now, this isn't a sermon about poverty, so we can't dive into it in detail. But in short, to follow Jesus is to participate completely in his call for the kingdom of God and in his renewal of our world that is ongoing, and to let go of our idols. Jesus didn't ask the rich young man to give a tithe. He asked him to upend his life in love of God and in service of others. So many of the Old Testament laws on property, on the Sabbath, on Jubilee, on poverty, on the vulnerable, the refugee, the orphan, and the widow, they all point to a God who reaches out to the poor, who seeks a just and generous society, and who calls us then to act sacrificially and generously in our care for those around us, including and especially the poor. So is my love for my neighbours sacrificial and generous? Is it uncomfortable? Is yours? Have you seen this photo of a statue? It's called Homeless Jesus. There's a few of them around. I think this one's in Toronto. When was the last time I shook the hand of someone who was begging, asked their name, joined them on the pavement for a chat? Can I invite you to do that this week? Whether it's down in Kew Junction, whether it's at Flinders Street Station. When was the last time I was generous and sacrificial in my response to the poor? When did I feed the hungry and welcome the stranger? Am I willing to give my all to God? Peter certainly feels like he has. We have given everything to follow you. We've got it sorted. So obviously the rich young man couldn't do it, but we've done it. He may have given up all of his wealth and idols, but he's picked up a brand new one called ego, and he's carrying that around with him really close. Now we know later in the story that Peter had hardly even begun to comprehend what he would be asked to give up for Jesus, and it is big. But Jesus reassures Peter, yeah, those sacrifices are seen. But in the end, none of them matter in the light of God's grace for us. I think it was Hudson Taylor who said, I can't seem to do a sacrificial, good, blessing thing for God, because every time I do it, I end up getting blessings back, and then I end up better than I was before, and it just ends up in this ridiculous cycle. How frustrating. Constant debt to God. So what are we holding back from God? Can we let ourselves be in debt to him? It's an ongoing practice, but he does ask it of us. And it costs nothing less than everything. So I invite you into debt with the living God. It's a wonderful place to be. Let's stand and sing.